hello to anyone interested in how to fix their troubled finances. Why do I say troubled finances? Because many people have troubled finances in some form or another. I'm David G. Toussaint with TroubledFinances.com. And why do we have troubled finances? Because the world has a plan for your money and my money, and that is to take it from us. So to avoid the world taking our money from us, we show you a better plan. That plan, by the way, is God's plan. What? You mean God has a plan for my money? Yes, He does have a plan for your money and my money. The good news is it's a much better plan than the world's. But before we go into God's plan, let's provide a real-life story. Now, before we go into the real-life story, let me introduce a good friend of mine, my cousin, Scott Toussaint. Scott's one of those determined individuals who, after being in the employment business for 20 plus years, sold his business, went back to school, seminary no less, obtained his master's degree, then went on to obtain a doctorate of ministry in career transition. So he comes to us with great credentials to talk about husbands and wives communication, or the lack thereof as it applies to jobs and to finances. As he noted to me, some of the stories are quite surprising, but we both want to emphasize they're all real. Today we're going to specifically deal with Marty afraid to tell her husband, which is a story that I dealt with personally. But Scott's going to tell a similar story about different people. The huge question is, what would you tell this couple, or better yet, what would God tell this couple? So, with that introduction, here's my cousin, and I'm thankful to say a dear friend. Scott, thanks for joining me today.
Good morning, Dave. Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to do ministry with you.
Okay, when you have an example of a guy afraid to tell his wife, and as a matter of fact, as I recall, you said he went to the parking lot and parked there rather than to go to work because he was so afraid to tell his wife. What a miserable situation, right?
That's true. It's amazing over the years that I was in the employment business. I ran across many situations where, husbands and wives were afraid to talk to one another about the condition of their job, whether they were worried about getting laid off, whether they were worried about not getting a raise or getting a poor performance review. And what happens more times than not in these situations is a communication breaks down between husbands and wives. And that leads to deeper problems, many times financial issues. Sometimes it even leads to divorce. And we know that about half of the people that lose their jobs that are mid-level managers or above end up getting divorced as a result of that thing. So it's a very, very pervasive problem that transcends what you think on the surface is happening. In this particular case, a fellow that I was coaching got a new job and was very, very insecure about how he was doing. Every day he'd ask his boss, how am I doing? How am I doing? How am I doing? Not that some of us haven't done that when we start a new job, but he was very insistent.
He carried it too far.
And I kept saying, please don't do that. Please stop, because, your paycheck is the indication that you're doing a good job. But one day he called me, and I said, well, what's going on today? He says, well, I'm embarrassed to tell you, but I'm in a parking lot. I said, what happened? He said, well, I got fired because I kept asking how I was doing. And
that's a sad story. My goodness gracious.
Oh, it is. And he was afraid to tell his wife, afraid to go home. And so he ended up going to the parking lot for many days, pretending to be at work. He left at his usual time, came home at his usual time.
My goodness.
And the problem, of course, in these kinds of situations is that if you don't have that money coming in, you're spending money, and credit card debt went up and other things went up. And, it's so important for husbands and wives to communicate. But men traditionally, I don't want to say exclusively, but traditionally, men communicate less when they're under a lot of stress at work. And that's because we know statistically 91% of men get their identity from their jobs.
The situation is going to be very obvious shortly because he's going to run out of money. So the longer he waits, the deeper the hole he digs, right?
Well, that's true. And sometimes people don't think that their spouse will understand their situation. Many times in my experience, a man will come home and finally, say, gee, I'm embarrassed, but I lost my job. And his wife will say, but, we're all healthy. They've got so many of God's blessings. We're healthy. We've got a home over our heads, roof over our heads and so on. But there's this dichotomy of communication, because most of the times one spouse is concerned more about what I'm going to call the family dynamics. Everybody's healthy and so on. The other spouse tends to be concerned about, but how are we going to pay for things, and how are we going to buy things and pay the mortgage and do the other things? And this is where communication tends to break down, and spouses pull away from each other because they're not used to communicating and sharing their deepest, darkest secrets when it comes to jobs and money, which we both know is a huge, huge problem in many, many families today.
Yeah, but if you hide something, that when the issue comes to fruition, it will be even bigger than if you had not hidden it in the first place.
Well, and this story, thankfully, is a happy ending. He did lose his job. I worked with him and coached him for quite a period of time, many months. And he ended up getting another position that was actually better than the one that he lost.
Oh, well, that's good.
And so it had a happy ending,
yeah.
But it was not without some turmoil in the middle of the story.
I guess so.
But, a devout Christian guy, devout Christian family. So that, this happens to Christians as well as to non-Christians or to any other sector of our community.
But this guy apparently was pretty insecure. Otherwise, he would not have been asking his former boss, "How am I doing? How am I doing? How am I doing?" Because that's an indication of an insecure person to have to keep asking that question.
Well, that's true. But what I think that many people don't realize, that in the process of grieving, which we've all known and talked about, throughout the years, when someone passes away that you cared about, the grieving process takes about a year, especially if it's a parent. Mm-hmm. You look at, today's the first day I'm alive and my dad isn't, or my mom isn't, mm-hmm. or my brother or sister isn't. But when you lose a job that you loved, and that was the case in this fellow's initial job, mm-hmm.
The
grieving process goes on 2 years.
Oh, really?
It goes on twice as long as the death of a person.
Wow.
And that's because what we call the bargaining stage of grieving. When someone passes away, we don't hold out hope that they'll be
resurrected
today.
Right.
And continue their life. Uh-huh. Whereas if we have a job that we really love and we lose the job, we tend to go back and play in our minds, why did we lose that job? Mm-hmm. What could we have done differently? Gee, maybe if I go back, mm-hmm. I can bargain my way back into that job. Mm-hmm. And that takes a lot of time in the grieving process that we don't go through mm-hmm. when someone passes away. So it can take 2 years. And if you do, even if you get another job in the meantime, mm-hmm. you still mourn the loss of a job that you really, really loved. And it impacts not only you, but those people around you who love you, your families, your friends, and others who have an interest in your well-being.
Well, I can see that, especially as you noted, if that's a job you really loved.
Oh, yeah.
That's the key thing. And a lot of times, if you have to keep asking that question, or a lot of jobs, there'll be some kind of thing that's not enjoyable about the job, and so then it's good riddance. I'm going to go on to something better. But in this case, he really loved the job, and so I can see. But that's just it's just amazing to me that somebody would have be so afraid to tell his wife that he would go to the parking lot, for weeks. Yeah, weeks, and just sit there, pretending to be at work. And so that's just quite an amazing story. And so the question is what should we tell our audience here about this? So, the obvious situations, they would just fess up to the wife, but is there anything else that we should convey?
I would say absolutely so. The idea here is to be, if anything, over-communicative, mm-hmm. more so than you would be. Because mm-hmm. when people in your family find out that you're out of work, they get afraid. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Where's the money going to come from?
Sure.
The kids are saying, gee, in school, am I going to be ridiculed because mom or dad is out of work? Or mm-hmm. I can't get the new coat or the new book bag or whatever it might happen to be.
Sure.
So I think it's really, really important when people lose their positions that they draw their spouse even closer mm-hmm. than they would traditionally mm-hmm. and share everything that they can possibly share, how they're feeling, how they're doing, what their prospects are, what the family outlook is, and so on, so that the family can do this as what God wants us to do as a family.
Sure.
This isn't an individual loss.
Yeah.
This is a family loss.
Yeah, that's great advice, Scott. I really appreciate that. I think the point is you said over communicative rather than under communicative, and then where this guy ran to a parking lot and sat there and for weeks. It's amazing to me the more I think about it. But anyway, the point is that he should have been over communicative, and instead he was under communicative. So, but you said the story had a happy ending. So this is a good story. This is the kind of stories we like to hear, happy endings. But it was because that number one, he believed in God. Number two, he had you to communicate with, right? And then you were his employment counselor, and so you were able to guide him into a better situation, and so it had a happy ending.
Well, that's true. And I knew his wife. And so, I was able to really coach both of them into how to communicate more once he tipped the scales. But it wasn't my place to go and tell her that he was, out of work. That he had to fess up that himself.
Yes, right. I can see that. But the point is that you encourage that communication.
Absolutely.
And that was a real important thing. And the key thing is communication between husbands and wives, because that's what God would want us to do. He would want us to communicate because He gave us this spouse to love and to communicate with and to raise a family, but that requires a lot of communication. So the emphasis to all this is that we want to communicate. There are many scripture verses that talk about that. But anyway, the point is that Scott, because of his training, he has some great insight into how to counsel this guy and his wife, which they both needed coaching. And so he did that, and then happy ending. So if we were to give our audience a recommendation, then we would tell them that they need to have counsel. And there's a proverb that says, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes. A wise man is he who listens to counsel,
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah. So what this guy needed to do was go to obtain counsel, good counsel, godly counsel, and then when he obtained the godly counsel, and then he would have the direction that he needed to solve his problem, which he got.
Absolutely. And this, unfortunately, is a different world today. In the old days, my grandfather, worked 50 years and got a gold watch, yeah, right. And you stayed with the same group of people that you went through life with. Mm-hmm. And today, that's really not the case. The average span of a job is under 37 months today.
Under 37.
Under 37. And there are new case reports that are showing that it's possible that people will have more than 14 jobs in their careers. And the latest data for our youngest generation that is working now says that they'll have 14 jobs by the time they're 37 years old.
Goodness,
so this is going to
change.
Oh, absolutely. And this is something that's going to happen more than once. Because the idea of staying in a job for your entire career is one that's kind of gone the way of the ages.
Yeah, that's a real sad thing, but it is true. It is true, right? Well, we're running out of time. So, anything else you want to say about this particular issue?
No, I just think that it's very, very important for people to really over communicate with their families and their spouses during this kind of stress that happens in their lives and will probably happen again in their lives.
That's great advice. Over communicate in this case. So, anytime you have stress, the solution is to over-communicate, not under-communicate. So, in closing, if you want to discuss any of this further, please feel free to email me or Scott by going to the website www.troubledfinances.com and send us a note, and we will respond. Thank you again for listening. I hope the true story on the finances helped you in some way. This story came from my cousin Scott. The underlying story came from the book Troubled Finances, There is Hope, available at the website troubledfinances.com. I'm David G. Toussaint. My cousin is Scott Toussaint. Have another great day in the Lord. Thank you.